Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. So I am speaking about state-produced and military-produced media in Iran. And really what I want to do and sort of take the opportunity of in the next few minutes is to talk about I worked on this research for my book, but I want to actually use this opportunity to push forward that argument and look at what's happened since my book, the research for my book, and my book came out. So for my book, I was looking at media producers within the Revolutionary Guard and paramilitary Basij organization and Ansar Hezbollah in Iran, and the ways in which they are engaged in media production and the strategies that they undertake. Um, in this conversation and for this new research, I'm really looking at what they've done since that has ended, because there's actually, in many ways, they've fast forwarded and have really professionalized the way that they're doing things in the past few years. So, in essence, I'm looking at how they create narratives about Iran as and Iran's national security for internal audiences. I'm not really focused on their external media productions, which they also have quite a bit of questions and issues around the axis of resistance and the geopolitical fight against the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia more broadly. So, in my book, I offer three strategies that they were undertaking. One was dissimulation tactics, in essence, removing as many of their fingerprints as possible from their media production so that audience members didn't know that they were watching films and media products produced by the military and state apparatus. The second was issues of nationalism, so forefronting in their stories questions of nationalism and really bringing into the backdrop questions of Shiism and political Islam, because that was no longer really resonating with audiences. And the third are new distribution techniques. Now, all of these have continued and especially questions of nationalism and dissimulation tactics and new distribution ones, but they've been really upgraded since my research ended for that book. And in many ways, their productions have become much more professionalized in the past few years. A big part of the reason for that is that the Revolutionary Guard in particular, has actually increased its wealth in many ways due to the sanctions regimes against Iran, because they control the ports and many ports of entries into the country, as well as the huge industries. And so the black and gray markets that sanctions and sanctions busting produce are really in favor of entities like the Revolutionary Guard. So they've increased their wealth quite tremendously in the past few years, and they are pouring a lot of that money into the media environment in Iran. Now, one of the ways in which they have shifted what they've been doing in the past few years in media is that and a refrain that I keep hearing from my interlocutors, is that they've moved away from the model that they had in the 1980s and 90s was emulating Soviet style filmmaking as, the revolutionary style filmmaking that they have been studying and looking at. And they quickly realized after those 20 years that they were losing audience share very, very quickly. And so they've moved towards what they are now calling a Hollywood style of filmmaking. As one of the prominent filmmakers, Revolutionary Guard filmmakers, said to me, I am against the United States in the wars that they fight. But when I watch Hollywood war films, at the end of it, I am so sympathetic to the American side and the war heroes. And that is amazing propaganda and amazing filmmaking. And so we have to learn from that. So they've been spending the past few years really studying Hollywood war films and the relationship of the Pentagon with certain Hollywood studios, and are trying to now emulate that. Now, the productions in the past few years are much more Hollywood-like in aesthetics in particular. Now, obviously, that's a lot easier today than it was in the past because of cheaper technology to be able to do those kinds of special effects, to be able to color correct, to give the films that kind of Hollywood color and Hollywood look. So all of these things have meant so that it's a lot easier for places or studios that don't have as much money as Hollywood studios do to kind of reach that aesthetic. But the more important thing here for these groups is that they've really made entertainment and commercialization at the heart of their filmmaking and television series today. And that is causing a huge amount of debate and protest within the wider Iranian film community, especially among those who are at the forefront of the Iranian art house cinemas, which put Iranian cinema on the world stage. They are arguing against this form of neoliberalization of the cinema and film world in the country. I don't have time to get into that, but I'm happy to discuss it with any of you when we all get together, if that's of interest. Now, what this has also meant is that there's been a marked shift in the production itself in the country as far as production studios and the political economy behind all of this. Again, I don't have time to get into the details, but there has been a proliferation of IRGC studios that are now, and production houses that have at their core making films and television series that are very Hollywood-esque in style, and that are all about success in commercialization and audience share. Now that we're thinking and talking about streaming, which I'll be in a second. So these big flashy productions and the question of being entertaining enough to have large audience share is only possible for three really big reasons that that I'm going to go into. One is streaming services. Unlike in the past, where especially television shows had to be shown on state television in Iran is controlled by the more conservative factions. And so there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through, a lot of censorship that filmmakers have to go through. And even those who belong to the state are constantly frustrated about the state television. So about a decade ago, a new model came out whereby instead of going on state television, films or TV series were being produced and then released on a weekly basis for like $1 each at the bodegas or corner stores around the country. Now with streaming, Iranians have moved beyond that and are streaming just like anywhere else. Now, because of sanctions, they can't get onto places like Netflix, sites like those. And so instead, they've created their own forms. And these streaming services are extremely popular, especially now under COVID. And because under COVID, so many people are watching, there's been a huge push for more and more content. And so there's been a really big shift in the Iranian media sphere as a whole, not just the ones from the state, to provide more entertaining content for these streaming services. The second, as I mentioned a little bit before, is the question of sanctions. The sanctions have made the IRGC much more wealthy in these past few years, and they are pouring a lot of that money into media productions. And so that is also contributing to some of what I'm going to be talking about. And then the third is a competition with Turkish and Western television shows. And so because of that, there's been a much bigger investment in television shows than especially from the military organizations than in the past. Now, there are two, I'm going to share my screen really quickly just so you all can see this. There are two shows that are important that I want to point to. So this is just like an interface of the main streaming service Namava in Iran, just so you can see it. But these two shows in particular, I want to touch on. The first, the poster with the brown background, Gondo, is a spy thriller that came out last year on state television, actually, and it became a huge hit within Iran and also surprisingly among the Iranian diaspora. And I say surprisingly because the premise of the show is about how the IRGC's intel services are really advanced on top of their game, tracking down huge spy networks within the country that are attempting to cause havoc and chaos within the country. It really lionizes those sectors of the intel services, and it was a very slickly produced show, very fast storytelling, is sort of very typical of spy thrillers. it became really such a big hit that they just actually announced the second season of the show. The other show is the one called Aghazadeh, the other poster on the screen. This is on right now, and this show is really about the second generation of the military and political elite, and about how that second generation is flashing its luxury lifestyle that it has attained because of the riches that their fathers stole or gained through corruption in the country. So this second series is really about the very, very hot debates within Iran and huge frustrations among the population against the state and military leaders for what is talked about as mismanagement of the economy and corruption and stealing of national resources. So this show is really about how that segment of the society who that second generation who flaunts its Ferraris and luxurious lifestyles, how they are now being confronted by the second generation as well, but of the more revolutionary committed of those folks. And it's really about this internal fight that they've now brought onto the screen. And so this second series is about addressing the domestic concerns and protests of people and showing how, yes, we do have a lot of bad apples, but we also have people who are going after the bad apples. And it's entertaining. It's caused a lot of discussion within Iran. And it's been something that has caught people's attention week by week as the new series comes out. So these shows, and then Gondo, the first one was about the sort of the national scale and all of these Israeli-American sort of plots to bring the country down. So as you can see, they are tackling both the national and international and sort of geopolitical components of what is going on, as well as trying to tend to domestic protests against them. Now, of course, a lot of this stuff is happening in the backdrop of this Israeli show, Tehran, that came out in the summer of 2020, which actually was not a good show despite all the PR that it got, and actually didn't get a lot of audience share. But nonetheless, again, another spy thriller about the nation and about regional formations in the region. So in I'm just going to wrap up because I know I'm going over time. Now, what I think is really important to keep in mind is that these are all coming out during Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which are not just sanctions, but also covert operations, cyber warfare, huge media campaigns and media wars, overt operations. So in effect, a war, except for direct bombardment of the country. It was coming out during that. It was coming out also during Trump's Muslim ban, which targeted Iranians above and beyond other nationalities, as well as Iranian students on valid student visas in the United States getting deported back to the country during his administration. So it was causing a lot of anger within the country. And I think really importantly, it was providing something that the Islamic Republic has been trying to induce for a long time, but has not been able to, which is that their rhetoric for so long has been that the United States does not want Iran to be a sovereign, independent nation. And younger Iranians and those who were more reform-minded, which were large sections of the population, kept voting for reformist candidates, presidents, and moderates to engage with the West. Trump's actions, his policies on Iran and on Iranians in general, began to induce what Karl Mannheim calls fresh contact, a fresh contact among younger Iranians for the first time with, maybe our state is right. Maybe the US does not want Iran to be an independent sovereign nation. That, and in the reality of the fact that the Biden administration, at least for the first 2 months that we've now seen, has in essence continued all of Trump's maximum pressure against Iran, has not lifted the sanctions that were imposed after the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, which Iran continued to comply by until fairly recently. All of these political and geopolitical considerations and developments are mapping themselves on top of these media productions And these media productions, and I've just talked about the sort of the formal ones on television series and films, but there are a huge swath within the social media realm that are really changing the conversations and pushing for new discourses about the US is not something to be emulated anymore. The US does not want us to be a sovereign and independent nation. And this is also then mapping itself on top of the fact that the Islamic Republic feels extremely confident in its positioning in the region. It's always felt much more shaky about its legitimacy and positioning within the state, within internally, because of all of the ways that Iran's population protests the state quite fairly regularly, actually. But this type of pressure from outside, these types of sanctions, all of these things have meant that now, combined with this media rhetoric and media productions that the state and military organizations have been pursuing, is beginning to shift discourses in very particular ways, that are against the US for the first time in a long time. Opinion polling internally in Iran is showing this quite drastically, actually, as are conversations that are happening in newspapers, online, and from different sectors of society. And so, as we're thinking about media production and questions of nation and geopolitical formation, all of these different layers are definitely having a big impact within Iran, and are having an impact, I think, in ways that are not being understood as in depth outside of Iran, in the ways that it's actually, despite continued internal protest and frustration with the state of the economy and the state of the politics in general, these wider geopolitical pressures are causing certain political and social formations in Iran, which are about a hardening of a stance against the United States, and about a deepening of a conviction for needing to maintain Iran as this independent sovereign nation. Now, how that ends up happening is something that continually is being debated in Iran. But the ways in which the Revolutionary Guard and paramilitary organizations are using the huge amounts of money that they've made off of sanctions and sanctions busting and pouring it into media productions is definitely beginning to at least have impacts that are, I think, require us to pay attention to. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.